What's going on, everybody? This is Brian Mazik, aka Unique Mazik. I am the hardest working man in sports and gaming. And today I want to talk to you about something that I've kind of had a bone to pick with, the way that injuries occur in Madden. It's been for years, right? Just about everything from the way they happen on the field to the manner in which you're informed about the severity of the injury during and after games needs to be overhauled, in my opinion. I have actually spoken with EA about this aspect of the game numerous times. And prior to the release of Madden 22, senior gameplay producer Clint Oldenburg, he actually told me, he stopped me mid-question. He was like, you ask me about this every year, and I'm telling you, we're working to try to get it in. They talked about, that the team took a look at the component and to see if they could get it in, but the changes that they wanted to make didn't make it into this year's game. So obviously there is some optimism about injuries being kind of overhauled. I do appreciate their transparency, which has thankfully been the theme for a lot of the developer and team's communication of late. Now, that said, it seems like this is a good time for me to share a design, like a full design, as full as I'm pretty much capable of producing, a full design for an injury system that would deliver a layer of authenticity to the game that also requires a bit more thought and strategy for the gamer, especially if we're talking about playing franchise mode, which in my opinion should still be one of the main focuses of the game. So first and foremost, not everybody is going to be in love with realistic or real world style injuries. So you always need to have sliders and settings because we all play the games different ways. So for me, 3 different injury settings. You either have real world injury settings, which is what I'm mostly going to talk about today. You can turn the injuries off, or you can have a custom slider set where you can kind of pull the injuries back a little bit, increase them, whatever it is that you want to do. So one of the first things that you have to figure out when you're doing an injury system, in my opinion, is what actually causes an injury, right? So for me, 4 different things should be a factor, or should be events, so to speak, or things that contribute to having an injury in Madden. Wear and tear on specific body parts. We've seen 2K literally put up like anatomy charts for each player with color-coded things that says where this particular player has injury history with their ankles, with their legs, with their arms. So they have a higher probability of being injured on those body parts. Now, I will say this, 2K has not done that well because injuries for the most part haven't even worked in the series. They work a little bit better in 2K22, but that's a whole nother story. Conceptually, that's the right way to go. And we know if there's any league that has good records on what aspects of what players, have been injured in certain areas, there's entire websites dedicated to NFL injuries and player injury history. That information is available and could be incorporated into the game. So wear and tear on body parts is the first one. The second one is fatigue. Any athlete, anybody who studies and watches and analyzes sports will tell you that one of the biggest contributions or contributors to injury is fatigue. Players get injured more when they are tired. You are more susceptible to injury when you're fatigued. So there's that. The third thing, which is the biggest part of football, is the collisions and the impact. Collisions and impact, you could be fully healthy, you don't have to be tired, could be the first play of the game, get hit the wrong way in the right situation, on the wrong situation, it can cause an injury. So that's the third effect. The fourth effect is torque, and this is usually on the lower body. And this is where you might get, well, maybe in some conjunction with fatigue and wear and tear on certain body parts, but this is where you get the dreaded non-contact injury. We probably are not going to want to see that happen to our players in Madden unless you really want that injury setting that I talked about, which is the real world setting. But certain types of moves, and we'll get into that a little bit more later in the video, certain types of moves put more torque on the lower body. So those moves should have some possibility of causing an injury. We'll talk about how that should be graded and so on and so forth. I'm going as deep as possible based off of my experience, my knowledge of kind of how a system like this would have to be created. Next, let's talk about the types of injuries, because obviously all injuries are not created the same. So you got dings, right? Guy gets dinged up, misses a few plays, but he returns. However, there is a hit to his durability or the durability of that particular body part. So that is, even though it's a ding and he came right back, there is an aspect of that injury that could contribute to future injuries or could lower the durability rating, which we'll talk about as well as this goes on. Second, we got the moderate injury. Maybe they're out one or more games, but it's not usually a season or career-threatening or a career-altering injury, but it's a significant enough injury for them to miss time. That also, of course, would impact the long-term durability of whatever body part we're talking about that is injured. And then lastly, of course, we have the serious injury. Out several games with some potential or higher potential long-term impact. So out for several games, out for the season. Maybe it's even a career-threatening injury. So we don't know. We talked about injury history, but let's get a little bit deeper into that. EA would be wise, if they really want to do this and flesh this out fully, uploading each player's injury history into the game. That way, you have a basis or foundation for which to base this entire concept on. And then if you're doing this in franchise mode, whatever happens from an injury standpoint to the players in the league from there is kind of building on your own history. Now, you might be wondering, well, what about draft classes? Well, draft classes could come, especially if we're talking about fictional draft classes where EA is kind of generating a storyline for you. Draft classes would come with pre-programmed injury history. And if you're doing a custom draft class, you have an opportunity, if you want, to either have that randomized or allow the users themselves to customize fictional players, give them their own injury history. So if you want to have a great quarterback who's got this fantastic arm and super high football IQ, accurate and a whole nine, but he's had torn ACL in the left and right knee. So there's this questionable injury history. Maybe he's got a bad back, something to that effect. That would just only add to the overall story. A very important part of injury is the recovery rating. How fast does a player recover? There needs to be a recovery rating added to each particular player, and this could be dictated by several different factors. The average time that they've been injured, how long are they generally out. They could come up with this on, with several different details, but a recovery rating is important because it helps to dictate how quickly a player can recover between games. That's important because maybe this one player who doesn't have a high recovery rating gets a moderate injury. And if there was a player who had a higher recovery rating, that player might come back and be ready to play the next game. But the player with a lower recovery rating, which could be affected by age, how many times that particular body part's been injured, all of that, it could make for a longer recovery. Younger players will usually recover quicker, and the amount of times injured to a specific body part decreases the recovery rating. If we backtrack a little bit, go back up to what causes an injury, every single one of those events that I mentioned, the wear and tear on the body parts, fatigue, impact, torque of the body, each one of those events, EA's collision detection engine, the whole nine, needs to determine what body parts were potentially impacted with each one of these events. So if there's a truck stick, we're looking at the lead shoulder, the lead arm, maybe the lead knee, even the back leg, the back ankle, all of that would have some level of an adjusted risk for an injury depending on the type of tackle, the type of contact that's happening. If we're talking about fatigue, we're usually only talking about lower body injuries. We're talking about impact, it's whatever aspect of the body is actually being hit or whatever part of the body is being crumpled down. So pretty much we know that legs, knees, ankles, feet, those are pretty much in some level of a risk on every single play. And of course, the torque on the lower body thing is obviously going to be lower body. Now, what we have to be realistic about is EA is not going to allow, or I should more say the NFL is not going to really allow EA to depict head or neck injuries in this game. They are extremely sensitive about that sort of thing. There was a whole tweak that needed to take place to the collision detection system in Madden a few years ago to make sure that there weren't certain kinds of hits in. They are absolutely not going to allow head and neck injuries. So while that is a part of professional football, it's not even realistic for me to put that in and say, hey, there needs to be a chance for concussions. There need to be a chance for a guy to have, a neck injury or something like that. It's not going to happen. I don't even, and to be honest with you, I'm pretty cool with that not being in the game. We don't necessarily need that. So what body parts should be able to be injured? If you limit it to these, I don't really think you're actually very limited at all. And I think you can have a really fleshed out injury system. If shoulders, collarbone, chest, back, arms, wrist, hands, hip, groin, thighs, knee, lower legs, ankles, and feet. Obviously, fingers, that goes along with the hands and that sort of thing. But those body parts are more than enough. They cover the majority, I would say, of the injuries that take place in professional football and college football as well. As long as those body parts are eligible to be injured, you can have a fully fleshed out injury system. So when can injuries occur? What body parts are impacted on each event? We talked about that. Durability level of the body part, the overall fatigue rate, and the impact of the event. Every hit is not the same. If you are hit and knocked off your feet by a truck stick, if you are tackled by multiple guys, all of those different things should have a different level of an impact and thus should put a higher risk on certain types of injuries. The other thing is we see defensive players get injured during tackles as well. So they're also at risk of an injury in those situations. Each player has an individual fatigue rate. So the fatigue level, again, is a factor there. The durability level of the body part. Again, we're talking about injury history. A guy has a bad shoulder or has a shoulder that's been injured a lot. He happens to, get caught up in the moment and does a truck stick and it creates a huge impact. There's a higher probability his lead shoulder, if that's the shoulder he's leading with, could be impacted by injury. So all of those things are factors. Now we also have where we have to talk about what is a low, moderate, or high risk sort of an impact. Every kind of movement that you do in football can cause an injury. We see the non-contact injuries all the time. What I would call a low or low risk impact sort of a movement or animation in the game are jukes, spins, wide receiver moves like double moves, curls, anything where essentially they're coming out of their break. There is a chance a guy can roll an ankle, a guy can tear an ACL, hurt the meniscus on those types of plays. That should be a part of the game. So those are low risk, low impact sort of things where you're not going to see a ton of injuries or you're going to see very few injuries in those situations. But in real life, real world, authentic, realistic sort of an injury system, that needs to be possible. Then we go to moderate. We're talking about tackles. We're talking about traditional regular tackles, wrap-ups, blocking. Offensive linemen need to be able to get injured, and it shouldn't just be the way it is now in Madden where they're doing a regular block. Suddenly the play's over. They drop to one knee with no visual evidence of why they've been injured. Totally unrealistic. That's the thing I would like to see removed. Engagement while being blocked. We've seen guys in the midst of a block, they're blocking a defensive player. Whatever happens, sometimes they get their knee rolled up by another offensive lineman. They get their knee rolled up by another defensive player, and it causes an injury. Diving, whether you're diving for a tackle, diving into the end zone, diving for a first down, whatever you're diving for, diving to catch a ball, all of that can cause an injury. We saw N'Keal Harry of the Patriots get injured his shoulder stretching out, diving for a pass from Mac Jones during the preseason. I believe they were playing the Philadelphia Eagles. He ended up going on injured reserve, missed the first 3 or 4 games of the season. It happens. Hurdles as well. Even if you don't get upended in the middle of a hurdle, there's a lot of extension there. You're getting up high in the air. The landing can cause an injury. All of this, what I would say, is a moderate risk of an injury. On the high risk side, we're talking about truck sticks. Now we're talking about a higher risk injury for the player who's delivering the hit, or for the offensive player who is trying to bowl over the defender, and then obviously for the defender because they're actually getting bowled over. The person delivering the hit should have a lower risk of injury than the person taking the hit, but there's still a higher risk of injury on both sides. On the flip side, hit sticks. Again, both sides of the ball, it can happen. All right. So no injury, dings, moderate injury, serious injury, or just a hit to the impacted body parts. The durability, we have to have that durability rating affected for those are the potential outcomes. No matter what happens, whether it's a low risk, medium risk, or high risk, the outcomes is no injury, which is going to be the most common outcome. A ding is the next most common. Then there's a moderate injury or a serious injury to whatever the impacted body part is. Those are the possible results. Now, each level will have a scaled impact to impact the recovery and the fatigue levels. So even if a guy doesn't get injured, everything impacts the durability level. They get that durability level back based off of their recovery rating and the speed that they have that at. And then it takes into consideration the condition of the body part that's impacted. So there's like a machine, there's like a system that I think that needs to be built here with multiple factors that all take place at one time. And the algorithm built into the game is it's more or less rolling the dice. So it's kind of like a randomized spin with odds pushed in one way or the other based off of the factors. So recovery rate will dictate the player's fitness for the rest of the game, their season, and the career. Fast recovery might bring a player back close to 100% durability for the body part if they aren't injured at all. So then we also have something called risk windows, dictated by the completion of the animation. So each one of these actions that I'm talking about are attached to an animation in the game. Once that animation is completed, whatever that risk window is, which is dictated by all these other factors that we've been talking about, now that window is closed and they are no longer susceptible to whatever injury possibility is attached to that animation at that time. But obviously, we're seeing successive animations coming from, with almost every move of the stick or every press of a button. So it sounds like, there's a lot going on, which there is here in this proposed system. But this is the way that many of the systems already work in the game. Whether, this is how it's determined whether or not a catch is made, whether or not a hit causes a fumble. It's these same kinds of if-then systems with multiple factors. Now, the fumbling still, which obviously we see fumbles happen when players get hit and injured, but fumbles should still sometimes occur during injuries. This should impact quarterback scrambling because in football, this is one of the issues that I do have with Madden. In football, the biggest risk for a running quarterback isn't actually fumbling, which is the case in Madden. Madden used the fact that your quarterback's going to fumble at an excessively high rate. They use that to control running quarterbacks, to deter you from just going crazy with Lamar Jackson. But the biggest risk in real football is your quarterback getting hurt. You do not want to put what is normally a smaller guy at risk from taking hits from opposing defenses. That's the biggest deterrent. Yes, there are quarterbacks that probably fumble on a higher clip than running backs, but that biggest deterrent is them getting hurt. That system needs to be put in the proper place in Madden. It's not where it needs to be. So then there's also playing hurt. The same system with respect to the fatigue rating, body part durability appropriately impacted after the injury, and in accordance to previous and possibly impacted injuries. That's what has to determine if a player can play hurt, how soon they'll be able to play hurt. That system's already kind of in the game, but it can just kind of be tweaked and wrapped around what I'm proposing here now. So I think for the most part, we covered how players can get injured, all of the factors that would be involved. And I know it's kind of crazy. It took me a few days to put this all together. But now let's talk about one of the biggest issues, and one of the things that I've actually spoken to EA about directly is the presentation and the delivery of the information about injuries. So first and foremost, with presentation, you need branching animations It's very important to maintain the realism and the immersion of the situation. It's important to build in at least 3 potential animations per injured body part that can also coincide with the severity. So an animation that shows the cart showing up for serious injuries, of course, and we all hate to see that in real life, but it is part of the game. And I do realize that might be a touchy subject with the NFL. That might be something that might have some, EA might have some trouble getting cleared, but that's a big part of it. But grabbing their hands, leg, knees, limping, etc., even if the play isn't dead, we've seen that. We've seen a guy running, maybe he pulls up lame, he has to grab his leg or start limping or hobbling a little bit. That's all part of it. All Pro Football 2K8 actually had that in there back in 2007. So we're talking about, we're talking about a long time ago. And, another game 14 years ago, a game on previous generations of systems, previous console generations had that sort of animation in. We need those realistic animations that take us from the play to the player is injured to tell the story properly. Right now, a guy gets injured and it's really choppy. So he's playing regular at first, and all of a sudden there's this slight jerk, and then now he's in his injury animation. It kills the immersion. Injury results. Now, this is another aspect of the game that should be affected by a slider, but there should be a slider for people who want instant announcements of the severity of the injury, which is almost how it is now. Or there's a simulation style, which is what I would be more of a fan of, where there are preliminary reports before the full diagnosis comes out, and it's given the full results. You don't get that until after the game, between weeks, when you're transitioning from your week 2 game to your week 3 game, whatever. And obviously we're talking about franchise mode, because just think about it. In real life, somebody comes up with an injury, you do not get the full diagnosis, how many weeks they're going to be out, all of that within the same game. But in Madden, you're in your franchise mode. They're going to tell you if he gets hurt in the second quarter, by the third quarter, you will know exactly how many weeks the person's out, the whole diagnosis of the injury. Just too much information for what should be kind of like a realistic sort of NFL experience. You just don't get that. I think that's probably one of the easiest things to fix in this whole entire system that I'm talking about. There should be some element of a mystery with some of these injuries. And once injuries are finalized, players should be able to be seen on the sidelines afterwards, out of uniform. We're talking about future games down the stretch. Maybe they got a cast on, etc. If they are close to returning, of course. So, and then upon returning, players should wear some protective gear on the injured area, especially if we're talking about guys playing before they're 100% healthy. We've all seen linebackers out there with the big club wrapped around a hand. We've seen guys come out and play in knee braces when they don't usually wear a knee brace, wrapped ankles. All of that stuff would help to drive home the immersion. You'll probably listen to this video and like, this dude is insane. Probably right. But if we got this injury system added into Madden, it would take the realism level to an entirely, it would take realism to an entirely another level. I appreciate you watching as always. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe as well. God bless.